Hello, I'm Julian Phillips, and welcome to this special edition of Arise Review. During the next hour, we're going to take an in-depth look into the civil rights movement and its impact today. The Arise special report, The State of Black America, begins right now.
Five decades ago today, Americans came to this honored place to lay claim to a promise made at our founding. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In 1963, almost 200 years after those words were set to paper, a full century after a great war was fought and emancipation proclaimed, that promise, those truths, remained unmet. And so they came by the thousands from every corner of our country, men and women, young and old, blacks who longed for freedom and whites who could no longer accept freedom for themselves while witnessing the subjugation of others.
Today, we're gonna let freedom ring all across this nation. We're gonna let freedom ring everywhere we go. If freedom is going to ring in Libya, in Syria, in Egypt, in Florida, then we must reach across the table, feed each other, and let freedom ring.
Few peaceful events have ever commanded the power and emotion experienced during events surrounding the anniversary of the March on Washington. They came from all across America, from big cities and small towns, to not only honor the past, but to demand a much better future, just as they did 50 years ago. Both events, the March in 1963 and the tribute this past Wednesday, will forever be associated with one man. Despite being hounded by police, harassed by those with hatred in their hearts, and feared by the political status quo, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. became a beacon of light for a nation that had lost its moral compass. During this program, we're going to explore what's changed since 1963 and what still needs to change. We'll start with a look back at the march that surprised not just the nation, but the world.
The crowd of more than 250,000 stretched from the Washington Monument down to the Lincoln Memorial.
We're on the move now. The bombing of our homes will not dissuade us.
Prior to the March on Washington, Dr. King led a movement through the South, fighting for racial equality, many times with his own safety at risk, having to dodge rocks hurled at him. The rally marked a turning point in the civil rights movement, forcing it onto the national agenda.
You recognize who this is?
Eleanor Holmes Norton is now a member of Congress. 50 years ago, she was a young protester.
We had spent 10 years in demonstrations that had swept through every single southern state. There was really no place else to go. We needed remedies. There were no remedies in the South. There was only resistance.
Less than a year after the march, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which outlawed racial segregation. Gladys Mitchell, who was there for the speech, remembers just how moving it was.
When Dr. King spoke, I mean, that was it. He was fantastic. I have never heard another person deliver the way he did it on that particular day 50 years ago.
Lee Allen Williams drove all the way from California to be there.
And it was heartwarming for me to see and to hear, and to have all of these different nationalities of people coming together.
shaped by the impact of his words still resonating decades later in the presence of his monument, a lasting reminder of everything for which he fought. Keon Williams of Rise News.
To dismiss the magnitude of this progress, to suggest, as some sometimes do, that little has changed, that dishonors the courage and the sacrifice of those who paid the price to march in those years. Medgar Evers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, Martin Luther King Jr., they did not die in vain.
With me is a man who was on the front lines in the fight for civil rights. Andrew Young was a friend and supporter of Dr. King. He went on to become mayor of Atlanta, a congressman, and our ambassador to the United Nations under President Carter. And I just want to take this opportunity. It was an honor to have you here in our studio.
My pleasure.
You know, back in 1963, there was a lot of talk. I was a young kid, and my father, we used to get our hair cut in the dining room in our house. And there was a lot of talk leading up to this march. A lot of people were very concerned at that point in time about violence. And a number of people were afraid to go. I'm proud to say that my father went, and we watched him on TV on our little black and white monitor there. I've got to ask you, being one of the leaders of this, were there any concerns in your mind about going forth with this march?
None whatsoever. In fact, we wanted to make it a more militant march.
Really?
There was a movement in Birmingham where more than 5,000 young people and adults went to jail. And it ended in the middle of June. And we started talking about marching to Washington nonviolently, going town by town. Dr. King and A. Philip Randolph, A. Philip Randolph was the elder statesman of the movement. He had talked about a march on Washington back when Franklin Roosevelt was president.
It was 1941, as a matter of fact.
And to integrate jobs for the military. So when Dr. Randolph came to talk to Dr. King, we decided that it would be good to make this a national movement, so that it was people coming from the north, people coming from the south, a plane load of people came from Hollywood, and it basically made civil rights for black people an international human rights effort, because that just happened to be the first year that Telstar satellite television. So it played in Europe, it played in North Africa, and it made its way across the continent of Africa. And so you really made this is where human rights took the lead in the global agenda.
Absolutely, and of course a roadmap for civil rights for a lot of other groups that have benefited from that in this country. After that march was over, and of course President Kennedy watched that march on TV, and he was kind of reluctant about it. Apparently, I guess it forced him to change his opinion about the civil rights
President
movement.
Kennedy was from Boston, and he really had little or no knowledge of the black community. His instincts were right, and he'd read very well, and he was learning. But you'd meet with him, and he'd ask questions for an hour, because he really didn't know this area. And he'd been elected by getting a lot of votes from the South, from the southern states.
So he's really concerned about that. And we've come 50 years later. Of course, you were mayor, congressman, the House of Representatives, of course, ambassador to the UN under Carter. 50 years later, I remember Joseph Lowery saying this on a report earlier, that much has changed, but then much has remained the same.
Well, it's true, because when Dr. King started the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, it was a threefold mission to redeem the soul of America from the triple evils of racism, war, and poverty. Now, racism is no longer legal. It was legal. Black people had almost no rights that white people had to respect. That has changed. I think we've made progress in wars. We've still got wars, but the Second World War, 60-some million people were killed. we're down to less than 10,000 in the Middle East. Now, we still have wars, but we don't have these wars that are capable of destroying the whole world. And the reason we're having wars, I think, is because the world has not understood how to address that last issue, economics.
And that's what I want to talk about. We're going to be talking about this later on in the program with another distinguished colleague. But we have here a disproportionate amount of black Americans that are unemployed. They can't find jobs. We're in a situation now where we don't have a lot of our own businesses, much as like we had during the turn of the last century. Where do you think we are right now in terms of that?
Well, we're working on, see, we couldn't talk much about economics back then because that made you a communist. And just as Dr. King started the Poor People's Campaign, he was killed. Nixon was the next elected president who really broke up the stability of the world economic order. In 1944, all of the nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and they agreed that all of the currencies would be stabilized to the dollar, and the dollar would be stabilized and guaranteed by gold. Nixon changed that. And we've been on an economic roller coaster ever since. Now, that's been good for Nigeria because the price of oil was $2.50 a barrel in 1973 when Nixon did that. I was in the Congress. And so it has been up and down. But there's no global economic order.
Right.
Electronic banking came in. And so there's almost as much money hidden in tax havens as is in circulation.
And we're going to talk more about that. And of course, you're going to stay with us. We're going to continue this journey on where we are right now in the state of Black America. This is a RISE special report, the state of Black America. Stay with us.
Many people are not able to register and to vote. We have elected a man of color as president of the United States of America. And some people today ask me whether the election of President Barack Obama is a fulfillment of Dr. King's dream. I said, no, it's just a down payment. We're not there yet.
We cannot be discouraged by a Supreme Court decision that said we don't need this critical provision of the Voting Rights Act, but a great democracy does not make it harder to vote than to buy an assault weapon. We must open those stubborn gates.
50 years ago, nearly 250,000 people descended on Washington to talk about and protest the lack of civil rights for people in this country. 50 years later, a provision of the Supreme Court's Voting Rights Act was repealed. Reverend Joseph Lowery said a few days ago, the more things have changed, the more they stay the same. And we're going to discuss the state of politics in this country, and of course the Voting Rights Act, with Dorian Warren, who's Associate Professor of Poli-Sci at Columbia University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Julian. Thanks for having me.
This provision was repealed. It's caused widespread concern amongst a lot of people. And I've got to ask you, what is your concern about this repeal?
Well, let's be clear. The Supreme Court did uphold the main principles of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a direct result of the 1963 March on Washington. But we should all be concerned that they have taken away a key tool of enforcement of voting rights in the South in particular. And so what this presents is an opportunity for all of us to say, what kind of voting rights should all Americans have? Instead of making it harder to register to vote and vote on Election Day, we should be making it easier. But the other thing, I mean, Reverend Lowery's right. We always take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So this reminds me of the Reconstruction era. Blacks were freed, got the right to vote. Reconstruction happens for 20 years or so, and then all of a sudden, by 1896, we have Plessy v. Ferguson. The court rolls back all those rights, and then we have another half-century of struggle. So we have an unsteady march in this country towards democracy and equality, and this is just another leg in that march.
It's just swimming upstream once again, and I've got to ask, are we chipping away at the foundation? You take this away, and then some would say, well, what's next?
What's next? There are some cases coming up in the Supreme Court around affirmative action yet again, around employment discrimination, the ability of workers to be treated fairly at the workplace without regards to race or color or creed or sex. So these things are a constant battle, and we have to be vigilant and not only protecting them, but advancing the ball further down the court.
To say the least, and some people would suggest, if you look at some folks on the right like Ann Coulter and some folks on Fox News, that racism no longer exists in this country. And herein lies a whole political aspect of this. Some would say that if we lay down and we don't challenge anything that's happening now in the Supreme Court and lower courts, we might find ourselves 50 years back to where we were.
Indeed, and on some indicators, we haven't made much progress. We've made a lot of political progress. In 1963, there were 5 black members of Congress. Today, there are 44. But when you look at unemployment, for instance, the black unemployment rate has been double whites for that whole stretch of 5 decades. So there's still several areas where we have to keep pushing to make more progress. As well, again, as you pointed out, there are direct attacks on voting rights, on democracy in this country. And so I think what we saw with the anniversary of the march is a new generation joining with that generation to say, we are here and we are going to push forward on democracy and social justice.
I don't want to be too tough on our black elected officials, but there are more of them. But someone suggests really what has changed. We have the Congressional Black Caucus,
yes,
and we have all these people here, but we still have unemployment issues, economic issues in our communities, poverty, crime, so on and so forth. But let's go back in time a little bit here and talk about how things have changed and the balance. There's this old saying in politics, there are no permanent friends or enemies.
Yes.
Back during Reconstruction, after Lincoln, there were more blacks in the Republican Party.
Absolutely.
My grandfather, who fought in World War I,
yes,
was a Republican. And then things changed. When and how did all these things change?
Well, things started changing. As you pointed out, blacks were fully members of the Republican Party because of Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War and Reconstruction. And then right around the 1930s and the Great Depression, we start to see a switch. Blacks voted for mostly Herbert Hoover in 1932, but by 1936, after seeing what Franklin Roosevelt had done with public works, providing support to not only white unemployed, but also black unemployed in big cities. This was after blacks had moved north during the first Great Migration. So blacks switched their votes. And then by the time we get to the 60s, there's Southern Democrats opposed every way to civil rights and racial justice. The Dixiecrats.
That's right.
And so by that point, you have solid conversion of blacks to Northern Democrats. Johnson signs the 64, President Johnson signs the 64 Civil Rights Act. When he signs the 1965 Voting Rights Act, he says, I've just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a generation. And what he meant by that is what we have seen. Whites left the Democratic Party, went to the Republican Party. Blacks fully left the Republican Party, went to the Democratic Party. So now we have a different party mixture, but your main point is right. No permanent friends, no permanent enemies. Blacks should never be captured by any party in terms of votes. There should never be a moment when a political party takes black votes for granted. And so that's where leverage has to come from to advance civil rights. African Americans have to put pressure on both parties to advance civil rights and racial justice.
Back in 1963, the fight for the right to vote. And we can still see many of us who are old enough to witness in our minds the fire hoses, the dogs and stuff. In recent years, say like the 70s and 80s, after the assassination of Martin Luther King, there seems to have been an apathy amongst black voters. You go into many urban areas where there was an excitement before. People are not voting. They're not voting in the primaries. A lot of folks are not voting in the major elections. And what has happened as a result of that, if you have no political power, then you get no services in your neighborhoods. Then you have Barack Obama comes, and all of a sudden now people are coming out by the busloads. But Barack Obama will be out of office in a couple of years. What happens next?
I think what we saw in this last election, where African Americans outvoted whites for the first time, I think part of that, yes, was a Barack Obama phenomenon, but more importantly, I think African Americans turned out to vote in response to the right-wing attacks on the right to vote. So all these states who have been passing voter suppression bills, making it harder to register to vote, closing the days that there's no more early voting in some places, which really affects the elderly in our communities. So I think we saw African Americans responding to those attacks and seeing those attacks backfire. And I think we are witnessing before our very eyes a new generation. The Dream Defenders come to mind in Florida, protesting the Stand Your Ground law that got Trayvon Martin's killer off. I think you're seeing a new generation who is saying enough is enough. We are tired of being apathetic. We are tired of not having agency and letting things happen to us. We have our destiny in our hands. And so people went out to vote in record numbers. Young folks are really getting involved and being activists, not only at the voting booth, but direct action, protest, drawing on the lessons of John Lewis and others from the 60s.
But the problem that we have, though, that I see, is the problem of one thing. I think it's a major thing, and that's balance.
Yes.
Most African Americans will register, if they haven't registered, with the Democratic Party. And what the concern is, if the Democrats know that they have black people in their back pocket, then they're really not going to have to do much to get that vote. There's no accountability. So even there were some folks on the far left in the black community that are saying, well, look, we need people of color in the Republican Party. My question is, the Republicans seem to stand for everything that black folks seem to be against. How do you get blacks in that party?
It's really hard when the leadership of the Republican Party is suggesting and showing that they're not very interested in recruiting black votes. So even though they were invited, not one member of the Republican Party or the leadership showed up at the March on Washington commemoration. So it's really hard in that context, even though they're looking maybe at Latinos around immigration reform and looking at some Latinos. So people like Michael Steele and other black Republicans have to challenge their own party to say, if you want to recruit black voters, you have to recruit them on issues they care about. The Republican Party can recruit black voters on social issues.
Well, here's the thing, and I want to throw this out because people don't talk about this a lot. If you talk about the base of black people in this country, the National Baptist Convention, most black people in this country are Christians. And if you adhere to the Christian value and the ethic, they're basically conservative values.
Yes.
So if you really think about it, black people have a lot of conservative values, but the Republicans don't seem to tap in on that.
That's exactly right. Black voters are socially conservative, but economic liberals. And so when you have, so there's an opportunity there by both parties to recruit. But when you have a Republican Party who is not even attempting to recruit on the socially conservative values that black voters share with white Republicans, it makes it more difficult. Imagine if Republicans were appealing to that from blacks. It would make Democrats work harder to appeal on the issues they think would win in terms of economic issues. So we do need, I think you're right, we need party competition for the black vote. But again, we can't only focus on the vote. The vote is sacred. It is the most important tool we have in a democracy. But after Election Day, work has to be done. Organizing, protest, calling, pressuring legislators, holding them accountable. That has to happen the other 364 days out of the year and not just on Election Day.
And obviously that goes for the general population, but of course it's far worse for us.
Yes.
They say, you know, when America catches a cold, black people get pneumonia. Is the future of politics for black people in this country bright? And I guess my question is, what do we have to do? And you're saying you're seeing some promise now amongst young people. But in your mind, you know, looking at this from above in the spectrum, where do you think we need to go? What's the remedy for us to get more involved politically and for politics to make a difference for people in this country?
I think in a couple of directions. One is to take the lesson of the first term of the Obama administration. In 2008, everyone was so elated when he got elected. And everybody went home after Election Day and decided, oh, he can do it all by himself. And I think we've sobered up and become more sophisticated. So we understand, no, once we elected the first black president, we needed to put pressure on him too, because he is the president. He's a politician. Politicians need to be held accountable. And if you look at the progress of other movements, of the immigrant rights movement, of the LGBT movement, they were pressuring the president all through the first term. So the first thing is we need to learn that lesson, and I think we are. I think we're starting to put pressure on the administration around voting rights, around mass incarceration and criminal justice issues, around education. So I see that as encouraging. Second, I think we need to recruit better candidates for office. We need to grow our own. We need to develop our own leaders from our own communities. It costs so much money to run a campaign now. So we need to revive our organizations, revive our NAACP chapters and other kinds of organizations, and grow our own leaders from those places, from our communities, to be able to say, look, you're one of us, and we're going to put you in office, but we're also going to hold you accountable because we know you.
Doreen Warren, thank you so much for your insight today on Arise Review.
Thank you, Julian. It's a pleasure.
In some ways, though, the securing of civil rights, voting rights, the eradication of legalized discrimination, the very significance of these victories may have obscured a second goal of the march. For the men and women who gathered 50 years ago, we're not there in search of some abstract ideal. They were there seeking jobs as well as justice. Not just the absence of oppression, but the presence of economic opportunity. For what does it profit a man, Dr. King would ask, to sit at an integrated lunch counter if he can't afford the meal?
Let us remember that Dr. King's last march was never finished. The Poor People's Campaign was never finished. Some 50 years after the March on Washington, while fewer people as a percentage in our country are poor, more as a number in our country are poor. And while the ladder of opportunity extends to the heavens for our people today, more are tethered at the bottom and falling off every day.
One man who can definitely talk to opportunities afforded to African Americans at such a turbulent time and how far we have come is Rudy Washington. He served as deputy mayor to former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani. Welcome to the show, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Jay.
You know, I remember in the 60s, and I'm sure you remember this well because we grew up in somewhat of the same neighborhood, you saw a number of black-owned businesses in black neighborhoods. But as time has passed, we've seen less and less of that, and we've seen more and more black people out of work.
Yeah, what you're referring to basically is what I guess people refer to today as an unintended consequence. As a result of segregation, we were forced into our own businesses. We were our own undertakers, our own shoe stores, our own corner stores. As you know, probably in your neighborhood, the corner store was owned by an African American. You know, so all of the businesses, little food stands, they were owned and controlled by us. They were restricted in terms of their growth. There was no ability to expand and have real economic development like what you see in New York today and some of the new immigrant groups. That opportunity never presented themselves, but we were self-employed and we were helping ourselves. We weren't looking for a handout. As a result of what happened next was that, and I think it was something very cruel that was probably a continuation of not wanting to acknowledge Dr. King's dream. We saw all those businesses disappear. Today, and I was over at my parents' house yesterday, same neighborhood. None of the stores are controlled by us, not even the corner store. In your old neighborhood where you grew up, I'm sure the story is the same. It's not controlled by us. Go through Brooklyn, Manhattan, Bronx. And the story is really sad for African Americans in businesses across the city of any kind.
So the whole dream of freedom and opportunity that was enacted in part, the catalyst, the March on Washington, has a dream and a truth that's still been unrealized in many sectors of the black community.
Yes, and I believe, you know, like I said, you know, and I come out of the business community, it was very cruel. If you look in the South, what happened in the South, there weren't a lot of people to play us off against.
Right.
So just with our honored guest that just walked off the stage, he and Maynard Jackson and so forth in Atlanta, when this period came along and they were going to build the airport, they created a minority program, and basically it was blacks and whites. So there was no way of playing things off and introducing a whole bunch of other groups and making everybody else minorities that you don't have to deal with blacks. They forced people, you know, to deal with blacks. And in some ways it was good because when the barriers were broken down, people began to say, we're not that different after all. You know, we eat the same food, we go to the same churches, the same type of faith. And they made a lot more progress in the South than what you see here in the North.
Let's talk about corporate America for a minute here. We have witnessed more black CEOs, Ken Chenault over at American Express, of course, Dick Parsons, so on and so forth. But on the lower rungs, the lower levels here, where affirmative action was supposed to play a part, it seems that perhaps in some people's minds that it hasn't. Where did we go wrong with that, if we have in your mind at all?
As I was just saying, what happened, and I'm very disappointed. I broached the topic with the honored guests, which I would love to talk to at some point, about our Congress. They were supposed to be the gatekeepers of affirmative action. And you know, we somehow or another let that word be defined as almost something negative now, you know. But the reality was, we were in such a cruel state pre-63 and 68 and 70, that this was designed to help us get into the university system, to help us to get into business. However, as I said, in the North, what you saw happen all around the country was other groups came and have basically, for lack of a better description, hijacked. And you see it today. The gay movement has hijacked the civil rights movement. The abortion movement has hijacked the civil rights movement. The immigration movement has hijacked the civil rights movement. So in other words,
you're saying that everybody else has basically benefited from this movement, except for people of color.
From the work of your father and my father and all those who went to Washington and all those who marched in Selma and in the South, I'm saying that a whole lot of other people. Now, I can't witness to the South, but I can witness here to the North where I live. When I go south to my grandparents, where we immigrated from, you know, I don't see, you know, because I'm from the rural South, but here in the North, you know, everybody has benefited but us.
We've got less than a minute left for this segment. I just want to focus on one thing. There's been a lot of negative, but in terms of the positive side, how in your mind can we change things around so things are better? We're talking about black unemployment very high. Fast food workers now are trying to demand more wages all across the board.
Don't leave out out-of-teen wedlock. birth out of wedlock. I think that's one of the fundamentals, the destruction of the family, what has happened to the family in the black community, because without a good foundation, we don't go forward at all.
So basically, in your mind, the family would be the foundation for a critical change.
Right. And we got to go back to our faith, begin to question what we truly believe. We have to go back to trying to put the family together, because I think between those two things, between the Word of God and the family, that's where our future is going to come.
Well, here's why I like you. You're almost just as good as our producer, because we are going to talk about faith, we're going to talk about politics, and all those things coming up on this show. Mr. Deputy Mayor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. This is Arise Special Report, the state of Black America.
It was a march for jobs and freedom. There's hundreds and thousands and millions of our brothers and sisters without jobs 50 years later.
And I think we all know how Dr. King would have reacted to have more than 835,000 African-American men in prison, 5 times as many as when I left office, and with 1/3 of all African-American males being destined to be in prison in their lifetimes.
The statistics are indeed staggering. Our African-American youth, especially black males, have been said to never have a fair chance. That prison is more likely than an education. To talk about more about these alarming rates and what can be done to begin changing the perception is Arise News legal analyst Seema Iyer. Welcome to this special edition of Arise Review. You know, look, we're talking about the number of males, black males that are incarcerated in this country. It's more than the population of the city of San Francisco.
Of course, and it is staggering, and I think that people don't realize how bad it is until you walk into a courthouse and see all the cases that come before judges, and most of them are black males. As President Carter just stated in that piece, 1 out of every 3 black men can expect to go to prison during their lifetime.
Okay, let's stop there. Let's talk about this. We live in a cause and effect universe, a cause and effect society. Why is there a greater preponderance of black males to be marched before the judicial system than, say, anybody else?
Well, let's take this back to your earlier segments. You were talking about economics and the black unemployment rates. Okay, now before, when we're here celebrating the march and the 50 years, before 50 years ago, the concern for Black Americans was getting rights, not being discriminated against. That was a time when racism was the law. Now, fast forward at this point, although we still have tremendous discrimination, in my opinion, that's not the law. And when you have Black Americans deciding, should I work in the fast food industry or should I sell drugs, which one is the easier choice? They don't have the young people, and we're talking about the poor Black people that come before judges. Their options are so limited because they don't have the guidance to say, Julian, you have to go to school, you have to get an education. I will tell you, Julian, I would say 98% of my clients at any given day have not gone past the 11th grade. And these are conversations I have every single day. This is a conversation I had yesterday where there are young Black men who don't understand that you have to graduate high school. It is not an option.
Right.
And they will say to me, listen, Ms. Iyer, I make more than you make in a week. I make in a day selling drugs. So how can you argue with that? And when you say to them, well, how do you feel about going to prison? This is your life. They said, well, it's an occupational hazard. I'm sure there are things about your job that you don't like. This is the response.
Yeah, Deputy Mayor Rudy Washington talked about this, and he blamed part of it on the disintegration of the Black family, and I think there's something to be said for that. But let's talk about the legal system itself. A lot of people feel there's a double standard when it comes to justice for Black Americans as opposed to white Americans and others, that we get double and triple the time of sentencing for certain crimes. You're talking about low-level crimes like marijuana and the like, and therefore that basically quadruples the amount of people that are in the penal system, in the prisons.
That's right.
So, I mean, where legally could things change? So, for instance, Black youth, particularly Black males, are not basically produced and put before the system that's unjust to them.
That's right. Well, let's talk about Eric Holder's speech a few weeks ago, where he's thinking about changing the mandatory minimums. And in his speech, one of the things he quoted was that Black males are likely to get 20% longer sentences than white males.
Why is that?
There are a few reasons. Personally, from what I have seen, is that most federal prosecutors are white, and they are willing to negotiate more with white defendants and their lawyers for white defendants to get lower sentences. That's the reality. People don't want to talk about it, but this is what I see. That's number one. Number two is the other issue of the predominance of Black men involved in drug dealing. In our federal prison population, over half of the prisoners in federal custody are in for drug-related offenses. So again, go back to who is drug dealing. Unfortunately, most of the drug dealers are Black and brown people.
From a legal point of view, with less than 30 seconds left, your remedy to change the situation as it exists now?
People need to get into the communities, because sitting here on television and talking about this is just not helping. Needing to get to the parents of these children to prevent them from a young age to realize that prison is not a way of life. They have to change their thinking.
Okay, and that leaves the last word on that. Seema Iyer, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, this is a Rise News special, The State of Black America. Stay with us.
The March on Washington teaches us that we are not trapped by the mistakes of history, that we are masters of our fate. But it also teaches us that the promise of this nation will only be kept when we work together. We'll have to reignite the embers of empathy and fellow feeling, the coalition of conscience that found expression in this place 50 years ago. And I believe that spirit is there, that truth force inside each of us. I see it when a white mother recognizes her own daughter in the face of a poor Black child. I see it when the Black youth thinks of his own grandfather in the dignified steps of an elderly white man. It's there when the native born, recognizing that striving spirit of the new immigrant, when the interracial couple connects the pain of a gay couple who are discriminated against and understands it as their own. That's where courage comes from. When we turn not from each other or on each other, but towards one another, and we find that we do not walk alone. That's where courage comes from.
Welcome back. When it comes to African Americans and health, since 2009, recorded data from the Centers for Disease Control shows that African Americans dying from diabetes and heart disease are at an all-time high. I want to bring into the conversation Dr. Althea Maybank. She, as we discuss now, the state of health in Black America. Welcome to this special report. You know, we were talking in the green room before the show, and we still see this in many communities of color. You'll find young kids walking down the street in the morning before school with a soda in their hands, potato chips. I'm saying, my God, as the country has evolved into such a health-conscious country, it seems like Black America is lagging far behind.
Right, and we're still in this conversation of what do we have access to, and access as far as what you're talking specifically to as far as food, right? And do we have an overabundance of access to unhealthy foods and under access to healthy foods is definitely a challenge in our communities. But to take a step back, if we look at the state of Black health in this country, you know, it's a mixed review. We've had some progress, but for the most part, if we look across the board, we look at health outcomes regarding diabetes, heart disease, HIV, AIDS, cancers, we are still faring way worse than white Americans in this country. And there are many different reasons for this happening. When we look at infant mortality, which is really a measure of your country's social condition, and how well we treat our babies really represents how well we treat everyone else in this country. United States is already way behind most industrializations when it comes to infant mortality. When we look at it for Black Americans, our babies are 2.3 times more likely to die than white Americans' babies.
Well, let me ask you a question with this, and we can go over these stats, and they're so alarming and depressing. We have a situation now, we have our first African-American or Black president. Obamacare.
Yes.
Health care for everybody. Do you think that this is the savior for Black Americans and people of color in this country?
I think the Affordable Care Act definitely is a step in a good direction. It does provide a tremendous opportunity we haven't had as far as providing access to health care, right? So in other words, everybody potentially is going to have some level of health insurance in their pocket, and they'll be able to go to a doctor. The challenge is, it does have some factors as far as the quality of health care provided. I think it is moving in that direction more so than we have before in the past. But the reality is we're still not talking about all these other issues that impact the community's health outside of the health system. And so everything that you've mentioned already earlier on the show today, income, jobs, access to education. Education is the best protective factor for a person's health. Evidence shows us that the higher the level of education you have, the better your health status. So if we're in some cities in which you're graduating only half of Black and Latino students, how can we expect them to be healthy? So we do have to kind of move the conversation, talk about these social determinants of health, where we live, work, play, and pray, and how that impacts on our health outside of the system.
Food, nutritional values, what you put into your system, obviously has an effect on your cognitive values and how you listen, how you learn, how you take things in at a young age. But you know, there are many people say that you can't mandate health. In New York City, the mayor wanted this ban on soft drinks, over 16 ounces or whatever it was on these jumbo drinks. And there was a lot of protest over that. People are protesting, saying, well, look, government can't mandate what we do with our lives. That being the case, if that's what people are saying, how do you educate people to eat the right things, to drink the right things, and make them understand that nutrition is key and important in their growth?
Well, I think there are several factors, right? So, you know, I come from a government perspective, honestly, and so government has been regulating our health for many years. You know, we regulate as regards if you go into a restaurant. One of the reasons why we don't get sick and end up in the hospital is because of regulation that government has. Immunizations, we don't die of diseases the way we did infectious diseases because of regulation of the government. And so I think as we move into this era of chronic diseases and not so much infectious diseases, so heart disease, how do we help our community? How do we protect the population's health? Government's role is to implement and create policy. That's just one of the roles, right? But we do need to educate around it and why is it important to either to have that policy or educate what is it that our communities can do to change the environments that they work in or that they live in as well and play in. And that we as a community actually have the power to change the health environment. So there are many initiatives in which people are working with their supermarkets to speak to the owners to change over what's there. We have to create a certain level of demand among our communities. And it really does take a certain amount of one-on-one or working with our faith-based institutions, working with our schools to have those conversations and parents to provide them tools of what they can do for action.
Everything, it seems like it boils back down to personal responsibility, of course, and in the family. And of course, we've run out of time. We could talk more.
I know.
Dr. Aletha Maybank, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Okay. And this is a special edition of Arise Review, the state of Black America. Stay with us.
We should all thank God for Dr. King and John Lewis and all those who gave us a dream to guide us. A dream they paid for, like our founders, with their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor. God bless them, and God bless America.
But we would do well to recall that day itself also belonged to those ordinary people whose names never appeared in the history books. They had seen loved ones beaten and children fire-hosed. And they had every reason to lash out in anger or resign themselves to a bitter fate. And yet, they chose a different path. In the face of hatred, they prayed for their tormentors. In the face of violence, they stood up and sat in with the moral force of nonviolence. They had learned through hard experience what Frederick Douglass once taught, that freedom is not given, it must be won through struggle and discipline, persistence and faith.
Faith has been an important factor in the life of many African Americans. The Black church played a major role in the civil rights movement, and to get through some of the most difficult times was the will of God getting through them. And to help us to talk about the significance of faith in Black America is blogger with TheRoot.com, Kelly Goff, and of course joining us once again is Ambassador Andrew Young. You know, you go back to those days of the freedom marches and, of course, Mahalia Jackson singing, and I'm saying, my God, those spirituals, the gospel songs and stuff, there's just no way I don't think we could have gotten through without God.
Could not have.
Where are we now?
Well, I tell you, the thing is, there are probably a lot of people going to church, but the church meets a group need, and I think that there's a transcendent need in each individual. You know you're more than flesh and blood. And church is an attempt to connect with your spiritual foundations.
But I'm hearing from some ministers, in fact, my own pastor, the Reverend Dr. A.R. Bernard, the Christian Cultural Center, is saying that the gospel now has been co-opted to a politically correct gospel, that it's not the same that it used to be back in the days when people were looking at the scriptures, both the New and the Old Testament, and taking it for what it is and what it was.
Well, I will say this. There's that spiritual, we've come so far by faith, and I think of where I sit today at this table as an embodiment of that, because I would not be sitting here, none of us would, were it not for the role of faith in the civil rights movement. And I tip my hat to Dr. King and all of the amazing leaders from the faith community of different races, of different denominations who made that possible. One of the things I will mention, though, is studies show that only about 20% of the total population, that's across racial groups, are regularly attending church as of right now. And I do think that some of the problems we see specifically in our community, where the people who were attending church and the role that the church played in our community was actually so much more significant than in certain other communities, I think that is impacting a lot of the issues and struggles we're having today.
Well, Dr. Young, let me piggyback off of that. Do you think that the introduction of faith-based initiative programs in communities of color, particularly, might be a help and a catalyst for drawing people of color back to the church?
Well, I think that we go to church when we're not doing so good. And many people are doing well. And many people are doing so poorly that they don't feel like the church is relevant. But the church in America has become a middle-class phenomenon. But the churches in Africa that are growing are the Pentecostal churches and the holiness churches, where the emphasis is much more on spirituality.
Right.
Which I think actually circles back to the question you asked before, right, about this whole concept of the church becoming politically correct. We know, for instance, that the issue of gay marriage actually created a bit of a civil war, you could argue, among some Black pastors, with those feeling like it's something where we should be very inclusive in the church, and others feeling like it's a make or break issue. But I actually think that the reason the issue of same-sex marriage became really significant in terms of where the quote Black church is today is for a larger reason, which is there are those of us like myself who really had a hard time coming to terms with the fact that there were Black pastors who spoke about this issue one Sunday, the next Sunday, the Sunday after that, and yet weren't talking about some of the other issues that are actually really impacting our community, such as the spread of AIDS, such as the number of single-parent households. And so I think that for some people, one of the reasons that the church is no longer in the same leadership position for them culturally as it once was is because they don't see it as addressing the issues that are actually impacting us the most.
Well, we've kind of run out of time here, and as we go, that God always sends a person. As far as faith is concerned, I'm sure he's going to send somebody else to correct the rights or the wrongs in terms of how the church has impacted the Black community.
Actually, I would say the church is doing well. Not as well as it used to.
Okay, we're going to have to stop it there, though. Okay, that's it for this special report on the state of Black America. Thank you for joining us.
We might not face the same dangers of 1963, but the fierce urgency of now remains. We may never duplicate the swelling crowds and dazzling procession of that day so long ago. No one can match King's brilliance, but the same flame that lit the heart of all who are willing to take a first step for justice, I know that flame remains. And that's the lesson of our past. That's the promise of tomorrow. That in the face of impossible odds, people who love their country can change it. And when millions of Americans of every race and every region, every faith and every station can join together in a spirit of brotherhood, then those mountains will be made low, and those rough places will be made plain, and those crooked places, they straighten out towards grace, and we will vindicate the faith of those who sacrificed so much and live up to the true meaning of our creed as one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.